The Wyoming wind carried the scent of dry earth that day, its grains of sand brushing the skin like cold needles. Folks like to say June was the gentlest month in these parts, yet no one dared claim it while watching the wedding of Aurelia Starr and Jaxon Creed unfold beneath a silence heavy as a stone hanging in the sky. Aurelia, a young black woman of 22, stood on the steps of the small church in Bitter Hollow. The borrowed dress hung loose on her thin frame, making her look as though she were sinking into the cloth itself. Her hair was tied low, not for prettiness, only to keep it from tangling in the wind. No one came from her side of the family. There was simply no one left. The journey west had taken all she had ever owned, her kin, her money, and the quiet peace she once believed she had a right to. Jaxon Creed stood beside her, tall, silent, trying to hold his face in calm lines. At 40, he had already buried a wife, remembered across the valley for her gentle smile. Since the day she died, the Creed ranch had felt smaller, wrapped in the quiet of a man who kept his hurt locked behind ribs that rarely moved for anything but work. Today, as he spoke his vow to take Aurelia as his wife, there was a flicker in his eyes. Hesitation and duty mingled, as though he were nodding toward a winter set to drag on too long. There were no flowers, no music, only the minister's blessing drifting into the air, and even he seemed to know no one believed in it. After the ceremony, a few townsfolk lingered, not to celebrate, only to watch. Something in the difference of their ages, something in Aurelia's skin, something in the haste of it all, made gossip bloom faster than desert weeds after rain. Aurelia heard fragments of it, but never dared turn back. She simply followed Jaxon to the wagon. Each step felt like sliding over ground that refused to hold her. When he reached out to help her climb aboard, she jerked back before their hands could meet. It was a small thing, yet enough to darken his gaze for a heartbeat, before he withdrew his hand as though from flame. The road home stretched longer than usual. Hills rolled out beneath the sky, and the wind-bent trees looked like they too were bracing themselves against something unnamed. Aurelia clasped her hands tightly in her lap until her knuckles blanched. Even without looking at him, she felt the weight of Jaxon's silence, the silence of a man who wished no harm, yet had no notion where to begin. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had slipped behind the ridge. A single lamp burned in the corner of the small room meant to be their bridal chamber. Its thin gold glow trembled over the wooden walls like the house itself was breathing slow and tired. Aurelia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands still locked together. When Jaxon approached, only to offer her a new blanket, her knees shook. A cold swept through her, carrying the memory she never spoke aloud. The stranger who pinned her down on the road west, his sour breath at her ear, the grip that bruised her wrist. That fear had never left. It only slept like a beast waiting to rise. Jaxon laid a gentle hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture, no more. Yet she flinched hard, breath breaking, body curling tight as a drawn bow. In her wide eyes, he saw it wasn't him she was looking at, but a shadow from before he ever knew her name. He stepped back at once. No protest, no anger, just a look at his own hands, as though wondering what harm they could have caused. Then, slowly, he pulled his pillow to the far edge of the bed and turned away, leaving enough space for her to breathe. Aurelia did not sleep. The wind murmured through the cracks in the boards, carrying the faint sound of a rider passing on the road, and the gossip already stirring in Bitter Hollow. She won't let her own husband touch her. That marriage won't last. She lay in the dark, eyes open, knowing her new life had begun with a door colder than the Wyoming night. And Jaxon Creed, on the far side of the bed, stayed awake as well, not in disappointment, but in fear that he had married a woman carrying a wound deeper than anything he had ever reckoned with. The first morning at the Creed Ranch opened with wind sweeping across the grasslands, strong enough to tear loose anything that had not yet taken root. Aurelia stepped into the yard with a wooden bucket in hand. Her fingers so cold, she felt as though they no longer belonged to her. Well water in this season was sharp as needles, yet she had to draw it. There were dishes to wash, a garden to water, floors to scrub. Work once done by Jackson's late wife, who, according to Mrs. Carter in town, did it quick and neat without a whisper of complaint. Aurelia was neither quick nor neat. Every task stretched longer than it should, not from clumsiness, but from the quiet dread that made each movement half cautious, half afraid. The bucket weighed far beyond her strength, forcing her to stop midway across the yard to catch her breath. Wind slipped beneath the scarf on her head, lifting a loose strand that clung to her cheek. From the porch, Jaxon stood still. He did not go to her, worried his presence might startle her the way it had the night before. Yet his eyes followed her every movement, not like a husband watching a wife, but like a man holding himself back from frightening a bird too timid to open its wings. By noon, Aurelia was wrestling with the stove. The small kitchen held a cast-iron range, dark, heavy, stubborn. She tried several times to strike a steady flame, but it kept dying, sending a drift of ash that stung her eyes. When she leaned in again, her hand slipped near the hot metal, narrowly avoiding a burn. Jaxon stepped inside at that moment. He said nothing. He simply handed her a set of tongs and secured the fire grate with a practiced motion born from years of working an iron stove. Aurelia stepped back, resting lightly against the edge of the table as though steadying herself. When the fire caught at last, he gave her a small nod and eased toward the door with the air of a man who realized he had entered a place where he did not quite belong. Aurelia opened her mouth to thank him, but the words caught, thin as a breath no one could hear. That evening, Jaxon set a cup of hot tea in front of her. He did not push it toward her, just placed it gently and pulled his hand back at once, as though that simple touch might harm her. Aurelia stared at the rising steam. It blurred a small part of the air, and Jackson's face behind it seemed distant, softened by the haze. She did not dare look at him directly, yet when he turned away, she stole a glance. A brief one, like touching a memory that had never quite healed. The rumors from town reached the ranch even though they never left the property. Mrs. Carter had carried fresh whispers the day she passed by. She won't let him near her. That marriage, just an empty shell. Creed's lost his mind taking a girl like that. The words never struck Aurelia outright, but she felt them settle on her skin like road dust, hard to brush off, harder to forget. She folded inward, walked softer, tried not to make a sound when she worked. At night, she lay on the far edge of the bed, hands locked together until every knuckle rose in sharp lines. As for Jaxon, whatever disappointment he first carried faded quicker than he expected. In its place grew something quieter, concern, carved deep as the wind troughs along the barn roof. He saw her trying. He saw her flinch each time he came close, not from dislike but from something older, darker. And he felt helpless, searching for a way to give her a sense of safety he did not know how to build. Some evenings when the wind pushed the window sash into its soft creak, he would stand outside and watch a last strip of sunlight touch her hair as she hung the wash. The warm gold softened her face for a heartbeat, and in that fleeting moment, she looked like something beautiful the world had taken too much from. Wyoming was bitter this time of year, but the sting of the wind was nothing compared to the cold inside a house where two people stood so close yet could not touch. Rumors of the creed, no-touch marriage, swept through Bitter Hollow so fast that within 3 days, everyone looked at Aurelia as though she were a secret wrapped in rough cloth. And when talk moved through town, Dr. Alton always found a reason to come calling. He arrived at the ranch on a wind-struck afternoon, carrying his worn valise and the arrogance of a man convinced he understood women better than they ever understood themselves. Aurelia stood tucked beside the kitchen doorway when he entered. His gaze slid over her the way a buyer might assess a broken thing. He asked a few curt questions, brief, cold, and each one tightened her chest. His voice carried through the small wooden room, every word a nail driven into the wall. "She's just a hysterical case, Creed," he said, tone flat and clinical, as if speaking of a lame horse. "Women like this don't know why they fear. You just need to impose yourself properly. Marriage brings its duties." Aurelia froze. From where she stood, she could see Jackson's hand gripping the back of a chair. His knuckles whitened to bone. The wind outside slammed against the siding, but its force was nothing compared to the sudden silence filling the room. The doctor continued, unbothered. "Just force things through. It sorts itself." Something fell, a small thing, only the wooden spoon that slipped from Aurelia's grasp because her fingers no longer held their strength. She did not cry, did not speak. She stood like a sapling bent backward in a storm, waiting for the moment it might snap. Jaxon rose. Not fast, not loud. Just a man standing, as steady and heavy as Wyoming stone before a cloudburst. He took the diagnosis paper from the doctor's hand and walked out onto the porch without a word. Aurelia watched him, his shape cut long against the thinning afternoon light. Then the paper caught fire. A small flame, trembling in the wind, yet burning with a hard resolve. Jaxon held it until the heat licked close to his fingers, then let it fall so the breeze could scatter it to ash. It was not a reckless act. It was the kind of act a man makes when burying something poisonous so it cannot sprout again. When he stepped back inside, Dr. Alton's silence had turned oddly stiff. Jaxon spoke only once. "I don't need any more opinions." His voice was low, roughened, but contained in a way that made the air itself feel thick. The doctor left. The door shut behind him with a weight that stirred dust along the shelf. Aurelia still stood by the stove. Jaxon came forward a few steps, then stopped, as though another inch might wound her further. His voice softened to a murmur. "You don't need to hear those words. There's nothing wrong with you." That single sentence cracked something inside her. Tears spilled before she could stop them. Not loud tears, only the faint, broken sound of small stones falling into a well. She clasped her hands tight. "I'm afraid of being taken, afraid of disappearing again. When he touched me, I thought I wasn't a person anymore." The words left her like shards of glass long held behind the tongue. Jaxon bowed his head, his breath so quiet it almost disappeared. "Aurelia, I will never force you, under any circumstance." For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Aurelia looked at him fully. Her eyes still held fear, but within them flickered a fragile spark, like a dying ember that refused to surrender to the cold. That night, the wind softened, as if Wyoming itself sensed the Creed household had weathered an unseen storm. Aurelia sat on the bed first. Jaxon came after, silent. He did not touch her. He simply set his hand upon the middle of the mattress, waiting. An invitation without pressure, without expectation. She looked at his hand for a long time, then set her own atop it, shaking like a leaf caught in a passing gust. They lay that way. No embrace, no words, only joined hands. A small moment, but one that shifted everything. Wounds would not heal overnight, but at least tonight, Aurelia no longer had to flee from her own body. And Jaxon Creed, in the dark, understood that it would take many seasons, more than all the winds crossing Wyoming, to guide her back into the safety of herself. Winter arrived in Wyoming like a sudden blow. No warning, no mercy. That afternoon, the sky turned a bruised blue-gray, clouds folding over one another like layers of wet canvas. Aurelia had just carried the last bundle of hay into the barn when a sharp gust slammed the door against the wall. The air shifted, cold with an edge that cut straight through skin. Jaxon studied the sky, his brows tightening. "Storm's coming," he said, voice low like a distant growl in the valley. They rushed to gather the tools scattered across the yard, but before they finished, a calf's panicked cry rose from the field behind the barn. It was the newborn from that morning, weak, easily frightened. In the rising wind, its voice carried like a child's cry lost in the dark. "Aurelia, get inside!" Jaxon shouted when he saw her running toward the sound. But the wind swallowed his words whole. She pushed across the yard, arm raised to shield her face, skirt whipping at her legs. Snow began falling so fast the ground turned white within seconds. The calf was tangled in a broken section of fence, kicking helplessly, eyes wide. Aurelia crouched, trying to loosen each twisted wire, breath ragged, hands numb from cold. A warning bellow from the herd made her look back, just as a dark mass surged toward her. The mother cow charged, desperate to defend her calf. Aurelia cried out, just once, before the impact knocked her from the fence, sending her crashing onto the frozen earth. No one heard the cry but the wind, until Jaxon burst through the storm, running like a man out of his mind. He hauled Aurelia upright, wrapped both arms around her, shielding nearly all the wind with his body. "Aurelia, can you hear me?" His voice wavered in the roar of the storm, raw, strained. She tried to open her eyes. It felt like trying to lift a weight heavier than she could bear. The world spun, sky tilting as though collapsing above her. He didn't wait for an answer. He swept her into his arms in one steady motion, holding her as if one more gust might tear her free. The short trek to the barn felt endless. The wind shoved them sideways again and again. Every footprint Jaxon made vanished under snow the moment it appeared. Inside the small barn cabin, he set her on a chair and shut the door hard against the storm. The room was dim, lamp glow trembling, an old stove breathing faint warmth. He wrapped a blanket around her, hands shaking a little from cold, a little from fear. When he lifted the edge of the blanket to her chin, their hands brushed. Barely a touch. But Aurelia felt it spread like a warm thread through the ice locked around her body. And Jaxon, he drew back, yet his eyes stayed fixed on hers, the look of a man who had nearly lost something he did not dare name. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice trembled not from cold, but from something frailer. The quiet ache in her chest urged her toward a courage she never claimed before. She held the blanket, tighter, and met his gaze. Fear and gratitude mingled, a wish rising beneath them. For a heartbeat, she wanted to give something back, to draw closer, to ease the weight she knew she'd placed on him. Jaxon saw it. He stepped toward her, slow, careful, like a man testing whether the earth beneath him might crack open. But when his hand lifted, just the ghost of a touch, Aurelia recoiled. The fear surged without warning, seizing her throat. The image of the man who once pinned her down burst forward, sharp as if he stood in the room. She folded in on herself, breath choking. Jaxon stopped as though struck. He understood in an instant. He pulled his hand away as if from a blade, grief tightening his jaw. "Aurelia, I'm sorry." The words were small compared to the weight inside him. His fist hit the wooden wall, one low, heavy thud. Not anger at her, but at himself for not seeing the fear rise so fast, for believing gratitude could become something more. He stepped out of the cabin before she could call his name. The storm swallowed him. Aurelia stayed behind, curled in the blanket, fingers trembling from the near closeness and the near loss, both arriving in the same night. The distance between them, nearly bridged, widened again like the snowfield outside. And Jaxon Creed, standing alone in the raging dark, understood he now faced a second winter, the one settling inside his own heart. The storm had passed 3 days ago, yet inside the Creed house the cold still lay between the two of them, like a strip of snow refusing to melt. Aurelia avoided Jackson's eyes whenever they crossed paths, in the kitchen, the yard, by the water trough. Each worked alone, careful in every movement, as if a single accidental touch might shatter something more fragile than porcelain. Jaxon stayed silent too. Not out of distance, but out of fear that any word he spoke might cut a wound that had barely begun to close. He spent long hours in the barn, splitting wood until calluses thickened over his palms, fixing broken boards he could have left for spring. He needed the work to drown the memory of Aurelia's terror, the way she had struggled to breathe when he reached for her. 3 days passed. No touch. No unnecessary words. Only wind sweeping the roof, livestock dragging tired hooves across frozen ground, and the heavy quiet pooling between two hearts, afraid to name what lay there. On the 4th evening, when a thin mist settled across the yard like the land's own breath, Aurelia stepped out back. She stood there a long while, arms folded, gaze lifted to the distant ridge. Against the deep blue of the sky, she looked small, like the shadow of someone who had waited too long for something she could not name. Jaxon saw her through the window. He hesitated before stepping outside. His voice was low, as though he feared startling a wild deer. "Aurelia, if you need space, I can sleep in the front room." She didn't turn right away. It took several breaths before she spoke, her voice light enough that the wind nearly carried it off. "No, it isn't your fault." Jaxon kept a few steps between them, far enough so she wouldn't feel cornered, close enough to hear the faint tremor in her breath. She drew in the cold air, then continued. "On the day the cow charged, I thought I would die. But what terrified me most wasn't death. It was how the feeling matched the moment he caught me on the road between Colorado and Wyoming. A cold shot down Jackson's spine. Aurelia had never spoken so plainly. She gripped her sleeve tighter. He dragged me behind an abandoned wagon. Said no one would care if a black girl vanished on the trail. I fought. I bit him. I ran. And since that day, whenever someone comes too close, I feel his hand again. Even when I know it isn't him, my body reacts as though it is." Her voice broke at the word reacts. Jaxon closed his eyes, as though the truth of it hurt something inside him. He wanted to step closer, but held himself still, balanced at the edge of a cliff. When he spoke, his voice was rough, almost foreign to him. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at myself that I didn't see how quickly the fear rose, that I made you think I wanted anything more than for you to feel safe." Aurelia turned then. For the first time in days, her eyes met his. They were tired, sorrowed, but no longer shut. "It wasn't your fault, Jaxon." He shook his head slightly. Something old flickered in his expression, guilt rooted long before Aurelia came into his life. "My first wife. She was afraid of me once. Not because I ever hurt her. I never laid a hand on her. But I had a temper. When I was angry, I raised my voice. One time I slammed a door too hard, and she cried. I've carried that shame for years. I hated myself for making someone feel small near me." Aurelia looked at his hands, the same hands that had shaken when she fell in the snow, the hands that had carried her without a thought of his own danger, hands that once frightened someone else, hands that now were the one steady thing she trusted in this moment. The night wind swept across the yard. She pulled her shawl closer and whispered, "I don't want you to blame yourself anymore." Jaxon swallowed the emotion caught in his throat. "I only want you to know I'm not a perfect man, and I'm afraid of hurting you more than life has already hurt you." "You haven't hurt me," Aurelia said, slowly, quietly, truthfully. They stood there, not touching, not closing the distance, but the space between them no longer felt sharp as a blade. It softened, like early spring water whispering beneath a layer of thawing ice. Something gentler had begun to move. Neither said it aloud, yet both felt it. And under the long Wyoming night, beneath that cold indigo sky, two souls, at last, were no longer standing with their backs turned to one another. February passed with more gray days than bright ones, and in Bitter Hollow, trouble always came when folks least wanted it. That morning, while Jaxon was replacing a rotten plank along the north fence, a glossy black carriage stopped at the gate. Its wheels scraped over the frozen ground with a sharp sound like metal against stone. Merritt Hawkins stepped out. No one in town failed to know him. The lone banker in the region, wealthy, powerful, and skilled at trapping people in debt before they realized what they had signed. He wore a thick fur coat, collar raised high around his short neck. Every step carried the confidence of a man who assumed no door would stay closed to him. Aurelia was hanging laundry by the porch when she froze. The cloth slipped from her hand and fell into the dirt, but she didn't reach for it. Her whole body went still, like a statue set in the wrong place. Jaxon walked toward her and eased himself subtly between them. He said nothing. He simply let his presence become a problem. Hawkins smiled, a smile that never touched his eyes. "Creed, I hear your ranch is still holding steady." His voice sounded like wind over a cave mouth, slick, cold, and hiding something. "Enough," Jaxon said. His tone was as dry as sun-baked earth. Hawkins's gaze slid over to Aurelia. Slow, bare, invasive, like sand scraping over raw skin. Wherever that gaze passed, she felt her body tense, not with the same fear she had felt with Jaxon that night, but a different fear altogether. The fear of prey realizing it was being measured. "Your new wife?" Hawkins asked, his voice almost amused. Aurelia bowed her head, fingers gripping her apron until the knuckles turned white. Jaxon answered, his voice stripped of warmth. "My wife, Aurelia Starr Creed." Hawkins nodded, a small tilt, the kind a man makes while calculating. You know the land law around here, Creed. Your north well is the only water source worth anything. If you fail to produce an heir, that land reverts to the bank. Terms your late wife signed before she passed. A cold wind swept through, as though to punctuate his words. Jaxon stood square. We'll manage. Hawkins tipped his head, eyes still on Aurelia. Town talk says otherwise. His words dropped like stones into still water. Aurelia's face burned, not with shame but with humiliation. The rumors about their wedding night, about how he would not let Jaxon touch her, had traveled farther than she imagined. And Hawkins used them like a blade, turning it slowly to see who would bleed first. Jaxon stiffened, though anger did not show outright. Only the faint tightening of his jaw, a small vein rising near the corner of his mouth. I'll take care of what's mine. You keep your concerns away from my wife. Hawkins shrugged. Just doing my job. Good land is rare out here, and not everyone deserves it. He turned, but before climbing back into the carriage, he cast one last look at Aurelia, a look sharp enough to make her retreat a step she did not even feel herself taking. The carriage rolled off, leaving dust and a sense that someone had dropped something poisonous on their doorstep. That night, beneath a sky with no visible stars, Aurelia heard a strange sound near the cattle barn. A metallic clatter, then hurried footsteps. She opened her mouth to call Jaxon, but flames suddenly flared along the barn's side, rising too fast to be an accident. Jaxon! She cried. He burst out with his rifle. Fire clawed up the wooden wall as a figure sprinted away, leaving deep tracks in the soft ground. Jaxon lifted the gun, his hand tightening, eyes turning dark and narrow with instinct and anger. In that moment, he resembled the man he had been years ago, the one whose temper once made his first wife cry. Aurelia ran to him and laid a hand on his arm. Jaxon, don't. Just a whisper, but enough to pull him back from a cliff he refused to return to. His body eased. The rifle lowered. The fleeing figure vanished into the dark. The fire was put out. But two things from that night refused to die down. A powerful man now had his sights on their land. And a new distance had opened in Jaxon's heart, where he questioned whether he could protect both the ranch and the woman beside him, without losing the last good part he still believed he had. After the night the barn was set aflame, the Creed ranch carried a different kind of emptiness. Not because the loss was great. Jaxon had stopped the fire before it spread, but because a hush settled over every tool and board like a layer of invisible ash. Yet in those days when hardly a word was spoken, Aurelia began tending to what she could mend, the small things. Early one morning, before the sun was strong enough to lift the pale mist, she dragged the wooden ladder from the shed and propped it beneath the main window. The old curtain, faded, frayed at the edges, came down. With patient hands, she cut the fabric, measured, and stitched. Her seams weren't perfect, but every one of them was careful, as though she were stitching back a small corner of her own life. When Jaxon passed by, he saw her on the ladder, dark hair tied neatly, her slight frame lit by a narrow band of morning light. He considered speaking, but instead simply stopped. Something in her quiet focus made him unwilling to break the moment. When she lowered the finished curtain, soft light filtered through, washing the room in a warm gold entirely different from the harsh cold of before. Jaxon gave a small nod, a thank you without words. In the days that followed, Aurelia tended the garden. She pulled weeds, turned soil, planted a few seeds Mrs. Carter had given her. Wind tugged at the scarf on her head. Some days it slipped entirely down her shoulders. Jaxon would walk over from the cattle pens, lift the scarf, and fasten it again with rough fingers that somehow barely touched her. Aurelia tilted her head slightly, not recoiling, only surprised by the gentleness. When he finished, she didn't look straight at him, but her eyes stayed lowered long enough to hide the shift in her heartbeat. She cleaned the chicken coop too, a chore Jackson's first wife had done each morning. Aurelia wasn't used to it, but she persisted. When the hens swarmed her, she stood still, exhaled, and tried again. Once she finished, the coop was neat enough that Jaxon found it hard to believe it came from someone still learning the Wyoming earth. One afternoon, when they carried bales of hay into the shed, their hands brushed. Neither pulled away. Neither spoke. It was the smallest moment, like wind skimming across still water, leaving only a faint ripple. But something tightened and loosened inside Jaxon all at once, enough to make him turn aside as though thinking of something else. Another day, he took Aurelia into town so she could buy more thread and seeds. When they returned, the wind rocked the wagon at the gate. Jaxon reached to help her down. She stiffened at first, then leaned slightly toward him, not out of fear of falling, but because having him there made touching the ground feel safer. The moment lasted barely seconds, but for Jaxon, it stretched like a season, and from then on, he noticed the small things about her. The way she always touched the edge of her scarf before stepping outside. The way her voice softened when she said, "I'll try a little more today." The way she stood by the window, hands wrapped around her own elbows whenever the wind shifted. He didn't realize he was watching her more often. Didn't realize that each light footstep in the kitchen eased something inside him, something that hadn't eased since his first wife died. He only knew the silence between them no longer felt sharp. It was becoming something gentler, like the breath of late afternoon before sundown. Aurelia felt the change too. Though she still carried her fear, it no longer rose the instant she heard his boots on the porch. When he walked past the table, she no longer looked away. Sometimes she even glanced back after he turned. Spring had not yet come, but small, green things were already waking across the Creed Ranch, growing in corners neither of them ever expected. And Jaxon Creed, without realizing it, had begun to love her in the way the western mountains love. Slow, quiet, unboastful, yet deep enough that one look from her made him feel he was becoming a man again. News of the arson spread faster than the last chill of spring wind. The next morning, Sheriff Miller rode up to the Creed Ranch, his long coat dusted and his eyes carrying the weight of a man who had followed too many bad stories for too many years. He crouched beside the charred section of the barn wall, tapped the burnt plank with the end of his pencil, and exhaled. "Creed, this wasn't an accident," he said, voice low and rough. "There's turpentine in the burn pattern. Ordinary folks don't use that to start a fire." Jaxon stood behind him, hands tightening inside his coat pockets. "You think it was someone specific?" The sheriff gave him a look that said everything without a word. In this town, only one man had both the motive and the arrogance to burn another man's property just to claim his land. Aurelia stood a few steps away, her fingers so cold she could hardly feel them. Miller nodded to her, then continued, "I also got a petition from the Hawkins Bank this morning." He pulled a folded file from his coat and held it out to Jaxon. "He's asking the court to review the validity of your marriage on grounds of failure to consummate. Says your wife can't bear children, and because of that, you can't legally retain the North Well." A gust of wind swept through, making the paper tremble as if it were alive. Aurelia felt her knees weaken. The whispers from town, those small, sharp laughs when she walked by, rose in her mind like birds startled into flight. Not consummate, not able to bear a child, not fit to keep the land. Each phrase pierced through her like cold needles. Jaxon folded the paper, slow, deliberate, as though resisting the urge to tear it in half. "I'll answer him in due time," he murmured. Sheriff Miller set a hand on Jackson's shoulder and squeezed. "Everyone knows that land is yours, but Hawkins knows how to twist the law. I just want you ready." Then he left, the yard somehow darker than the sky full of gathering clouds. That afternoon, Aurelia washed blankets with trembling hands. The sound of water slapping the basin repeated over and over, steady as the heartbeat of someone afraid. She hadn't looked directly at Jaxon since the sheriff arrived. She felt like she was the fault line running beneath his feet, the weakness Hawkins was striking at. Jaxon stepped into the yard as the sky shifted color. He didn't move too close, but close enough for her to hear him over the wind. "Aurelia," he said softly, "none of what Hawkins said is your fault." She shook her head. If I weren't like this, you wouldn't have to fear losing the land. A real wife would—" Her voice caught. Jaxon took a single step closer, narrowing the distance. "You're my wife. No other condition matters." The words sounded simple, but inside her they broke open like ice touched by sunlight. For the first time since the sheriff's visit, Aurelia looked at him without, turning away. Her eyes held fear, shame, but also a longing to do right by him, by this home. That night, when they entered the bedroom, Aurelia stood beside the bed for a long time. The dim lamp painted lines of light over the walls, over Jackson's broad shoulders, over the breath he held tight in his chest. She stepped toward him, her hand shaking, but not retreating. "Jaxon." He turned, surprise and worry crossing his face. If what happens between us could help keep the ranch, then—" She swallowed the rest. Jaxon rose immediately. "No, I won't touch you because of a threat from Hawkins." But Aurelia shook her head, this time not from fear. "Not for him, for me. Because I choose this. Because I want to do my part. And because I want you to know I trust you. I trust you." Those words tightened something deep in Jackson's chest. He lifted his hand very slowly, giving her room to withdraw, but she didn't move away. Their hands met, not like the night of the storm, not trembling with panic, but with something softer. That night, they lay beside each other for the first time without an invisible wall between them. And as the lamplight flickered out, they were no longer two lost souls scattered across the western wilds. They found something fragile, built not on possession, but on opening, on a trust that had taken Aurelia a long, painful road to reach. Jaxon let her set the pace with her own breath. No haste, no demand. Only tenderness formed from quiet days, shared silence, and hands that had learned how to be gentle again. And when night closed around them, neither spoke, but something new had begun, quiet as the last drop of winter thawing into spring. The Bitter Hollow Church had never been this full. Every bench was taken, and even those who rarely attended service crowded into the back, not to pray. They came to witness the end of the tale they had whispered for weeks. The young wife won't let her husband touch her. They'll lose the land because there's no child. Creed married a woman who isn't whole. Those words hung in the air like coal dust. Aurelia sat in the front row, back straight, though her hands trembled beneath her skirt. Beside her, Jaxon sat silent, broad shoulders braced like a windbreak. but even he couldn't hide the tension burning through him. He knew they were about to strike him where Aurelia was most vulnerable. Merritt Hawkins entered as if he were a man invited to preach. Long coat, cold eyes, mouth set in a thin smile. Behind him walked his attorney, a wiry man with eyes sharp as a freshly honed blade. Hawkins didn't look at Jaxon first. He looked at Aurelia, as if she were a defective item being dragged out for inspection. The attorney rose. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth but calculated. "The Creed Star marriage is not valid under the law. It has not been consummated." He paused, letting the murmurs ripple through the room. "And therefore," he continued, "with no possibility of an heir, the land containing the valuable water source must revert to the Hawkins Bank." Aurelia felt each word pierce her like a cold needle. Then the attorney turned toward her. "Mrs. or rather," he smirked, "Miss Starr, only a complete woman becomes a true wife." A few chuckles floated from the back. Jaxon shot to his feet, but Aurelia placed a hand on his arm. A light touch, yet strong enough to hold him in place. The attorney smiled wider, crueler. "Would you care to explain why your husband is unable to perform his marital duty?" Heat rushed up Aurelia's neck. For the first time in her life, she saw humiliation take shape, and it stood here in this church wearing Hawkins's face. Jaxon began to speak, but Aurelia shook her head. She rose. The church fell silent, so still they could hear the wind rattling the stained glass. A young black woman, barely 19, stood before the entire town, before those who gossiped, mocked, pitied her. Her voice trembled, but it rose. "I was attacked on the road from Colorado to Wyoming," Aurelia said. She spared no softness. "He dragged me behind a wagon, thinking no one would care if I disappeared. I escaped, but the fear didn't escape with me." Several women gasped. "Since that day, when someone comes too close, my body believes it's happening again." She drew a long breath. Her hands still shook, but her gaze no longer fled. "But Jaxon never forced me. Not once. He is patient, gentle, and to me, he is the first safety I've known in months." Jaxon bowed his head, not in shame, but because her truth struck him like a prayer, finally spoken aloud. Aurelia continued, "Marriage is not measured by flesh. It is measured by kindness, by standing for each other, by weathering storms together, by the things done in silence, when no one sees." An older woman in the back whispered, "That's right." Another murmured, "Poor girl." And the silence inside the church shifted, less cold, more human, more understanding. The attorney opened his mouth to speak, but Sheriff Miller strode in through the side door. "I have evidence," he announced, "that a man employed by Hawkins set the Creed barn on fire. We have a witness who saw him that night." Gasps scattered through the pews. Eyes turned to Hawkins. For the first time, his face faltered. No one cared about his accusations anymore. The council whispered among themselves, then returned with their verdict. Hawkins's petition to annul the marriage is denied. A gust of wind swept the window, stirring the lamplight. Aurelia exhaled, a long breath, the kind that leaves the chest lighter afterward. But more important than the land, the town, or the rumors, was the truth she had reclaimed for herself. She sat down, and her hand reached for Jaxon's. He laced his fingers through hers, not tight, not possessive, but with the quiet relief of a man who had found something he feared lost. Aurelia Starr had not only protected the ranch, That day, in the old wooden church, she saved her own life. Summer came to Wyoming not with birdsong, but with a wash of gold spilling across the fields as though someone had thrown open the gates of heaven. After a winter too long and too heavy with trouble, the Creed Ranch finally felt like a home, not just a shelter for two wounded souls. Together, Jaxon and Aurelia rebuilt the burned section of the barn. Neither spoke of the night Hawkins set the fire, but as they lifted each wooden beam, Aurelia saw the patience in Jaxon's hands, the same patience that had kept her from falling into darkness more times than she dared admit. She carried the lighter planks, doing only the tasks Jaxon allowed. The heavier work he kept for himself. "Your back is weak," he said, though she knew it was simply his way of hiding worry. And somehow, that softened her heart more than any storm could wash away. They planted the southern garden again. Aurelia placed each bean seed, each tiny flower sprout Mrs. Carter had given her. Jaxon stood beside her, digging holes, watering the soil, and sometimes watching the way her hair lifted gently on the wind. If earlier he had looked at her with caution, now there was something warmer in his gaze, something like the quiet affection a man reserves for the things that remind him life is not entirely cruel. One warm afternoon, Aurelia sat on the porch step to catch her breath. The work wasn't much, yet a faint dizziness swept over her, making her press a hand to her forehead. Jaxon saw it from across the yard and hurried over, dropping his shovel mid-stride. "You're tired?" he asked, breath uneven from running. Aurelia nodded. "Just lightheaded." Jaxon sat beside her, letting her lean against his shoulder. She hesitated at first, then her body settled into him on its own. Her head rested lightly against him, but to Jaxon, its weight felt like the whole measure of trust he never thought he'd receive a second time in his life. They stayed like that a long while, saying nothing, listening only to the wind brushing through the grass. When Aurelia began to drift toward sleep, Jaxon gently adjusted her scarf and smoothed a strand of hair from her temple. The next day, the dizziness returned. The morning after that, she felt sick while stirring the pot on the stove. She thought she had eaten something wrong, but when Jaxon walked in carrying water from the well, his eyes softened in a way that made her heart still. He set the bucket down and stepped toward her. "Aurelia," he said quietly, "have you noticed you're a few weeks late?" The water nearly spilled from her hand. She looked at him, unable to speak. The uneasy mornings, the strange fatigue, suddenly all of it carried meaning. Something opened in Jaxon's eyes. Not shock, not fear, but gratitude so deep it almost made him unsteady. He placed a hand on her back, not urging, simply resting it there as though offering her a steadiness she could lean into. That evening, they stood on the hill behind the house where the fields stretched into forever. The sunset washed the roof and the distant trees in a soft amber glow. Jaxon stood behind her, his hand resting lightly at her back. Just a small gesture, yet enough to quiet her pulse. "No more heavy work for you," he said. "I'm not even sure." "I know," he said gently, "but I'll take care of things. For you, and for whatever may come." Aurelia did not answer. She leaned toward him instead, letting her chest rise and fall against the warmth he left in the wind. That night, Jaxon lit the kitchen lamp and took over the chores she usually handled. He added cushions to the bench so she wouldn't grow tired. He moved with such careful steps that Aurelia couldn't help but laugh, a sound she had not made in months. "From now on, leave the hard work to me," Jaxon said, cheeks a little red but voice steady. Aurelia looked at him, truly looked, without the guardedness of early days. And in that moment, she understood. He wasn't tending to her out of duty. He cared for her as if his own life rested in her hands. The first summer on the Creed Ranch was gentle as sunlight lying over young wheat. Aurelia did not know for certain whether she carried a child, but one truth shone brighter than all the rest. On land once cold as ice, her heart had chosen the dark-haired, broad-shouldered, quiet man beside her. And this peace between them was already a miracle large enough to fill the whole horizon. The last wind of summer carried the faint scent of burnt grass as it drifted across the Creed Ranch, as though Wyoming itself held its breath, waiting. Each morning, Aurelia stepped onto the porch, with one hand resting on the gentle roundness beneath her dress. The child kicked softly, tapping from the inside as if saying, "Mama, I'm here." And in Jackson's eyes burned a light drawn from no sun, a light born of hope long buried but now daring to rise again. The town looked at them differently now. The old whispers had blown away like weeds torn up by a hard wind. Mrs. Carter stopped by often with vegetables, saying, "This baby will be special," and looking at Aurelia with eyes softened by years. Even those who once gossiped fell quiet when they saw Jaxon guiding Aurelia down from the wagon, quiet as though witnessing something sacred. The day Aurelia went into labor, the sky dimmed, and the barn loft's light took on the color of slow dusk. The pain struck suddenly, forcing her to grip the table's edge. Jaxon was stacking hay when he heard her soft cry. He rushed to her as though running through a storm. He caught her before she fell, his hands trembling, afraid that even a stronger grasp might shatter her. "Aurelia, look at me," he whispered, voice roughened, barely louder than a breath. She nodded, breath ragged. Mrs. Carter and another older woman came to help. They boiled water, laid fresh linens, prepared the small bedroom. Jaxon stood outside the door, scarcely daring to breathe. At times he paced. At times he stood as still as a post, fists clenched until his knuckles were white. Each of Aurelia's quiet cries struck his heart like the steady striking of a hammer. There had been a long stretch of life when Jaxon believed he no longer deserved to touch anything fragile, that heaven had closed its gates to anything resembling joy. But today he waited for something softer than spring itself, a child carrying half his grief and half Aurelia's steadfast courage. When the first cry rose into the air, Jaxon straightened as if someone had called him back into the living world. Mrs. Carter cracked the door. "A baby girl." Jaxon stepped inside, but stopped when he saw Aurelia holding the infant to her chest. Her hair clung damp to her temples, her lips pale, but her eyes, God above her eyes, shone like land reborn after a first rain. The baby suckled faintly, small hands curling as though searching for a place to hold on to this life. Aurelia looked up. "Would you like to hold her?" He knelt beside the bed rather than stand. The hands that knew shovels and reins now shook like they had never held anything so small. When Aurelia placed the child into his arms, he stopped breathing altogether. She weighed less than 4 pounds. Yet to him she carried the weight of every year he thought would remain empty. A single drop fell onto the blanket. No one spoke the word tears, but Aurelia saw his shoulders tremble. He looked down, at the tiny face as a man looks into a flame he thought he had lost long ago. "Our daughter," he murmured, voice breaking like dry ground touched by rain. No shout, no laughter. Only the quiet astonishment of a man finding light after years inside darkness. Aurelia guided his hand to her cheek. In that moment, The fear that had stalked her from Colorado loosened like thawed ice. 3 days later, they brought the baby to the porch to greet the morning sun. Children from town came to look. Adults lingered farther back, their faces softening as they watched Jaxon cradle his daughter as though holding his own heart. Old rumors had died in the wind, replaced by respect, and perhaps a quiet regret. That afternoon, Aurelia stood on the porch, her dress brushing the breeze, eyes on the field glowing gold. Jaxon stepped behind her and placed his hand over hers, so gentle a movement the wind could have hidden it. But for Aurelia, it was enough to change a lifetime. Because some loves do not bloom through grand declarations. They bloom in the calm after storms. Some stories do not need lightning or loud vows. Only two people choosing, quietly, to remain beside each other through every season. Aurelia and Jaxon's journey reminds us that though life may twist and break, the human heart can be reborn by nothing more than a hand resting over another. If this small journey reminds you of a love from long ago, someone who once held your hand through troubling winds, please share a few lines in the comments. Your stories are what warm this channel most. If today's video lightened your heart, please like, subscribe, and share so we may meet again in gentler tales of the Old West. Thank you for being here. Your presence is the greatest gift.